All right, we're back in the new FITSNews studio. I'm Will Folks, the founding editor of FITSNews.com, the media outlet you are currently watching. Thank you for joining us. We got a ton to get into this week. We're going to dive right into it. We talk a lot on this show about judges, about Palmetto State judges doing bad, letting violent criminals out. But this week, we're going to look at another part of the problem, particularly some seismic allegations against a prosecutor, and not just any prosecutor, one who played a starring role in the big Murdaugh murders, crime, and corruption saga, the main event of that, the double homicide trial of Alec Murdaugh back in March of this year. We're going to walk you through all the allegations against Johnny Meadors and what those could mean for the big Murdaugh appeal moving forward. We're also going to tell you the story of DJ Smith, or continue telling you this story. An unsolved murder out of Dorchester, South Carolina, a body found badly mangled on the train tracks near Ridgeville, South Carolina. Our team has been digging into this story for several weeks now on our Fitz Files True Crime and Corruption podcast. This week, we had a ton of news in that story. An independent medical examination of DJ Smith's autopsy, and our team went to the precise location where his body was found back in 2018. We're going to walk you through everything that we've learned on that case as it continues to unfold. Last but not least, we're going to go back to FITSNews roots. First in the South, people. We're going to talk politics, particularly the big presidential debate. Dylan Nolan and I are going to sit and break that down. Not only the debate, but all of the political forces that are impacting that presidential process. And I'm also going to provide an update on the latest South Carolina sex scandal. Broke exclusively on this news outlet back week. And hey, for once, I wasn't involved in this one, okay? But we're going to give you all that and more coming your way on another edition of the Week in Review. So earlier this month, I was at the Richland County, South Carolina courtroom for a hearing involving a powerful lawyer legislator named Todd Rutherford. Now, if you follow our news outlet, you know who Rutherford is, but he's one of many influential attorneys who serve in the General Assembly who are also responsible for picking our judges. Again, South Carolina, one of only 2 states in America where lawmakers elect judges. It's actually worse here, though, because there's a small clique of lawmakers led by Rutherford who pick the judges that the lawmakers vote on. So it's a double layered of corruption, if you will. But as I went to this hearing and saw Rutherford once again work his magic to allow a violent criminal who should have been sentenced to a mandatory minimum of multiple decades behind bars end up getting a very lenient sentence, as I listened to this latest travesty of justice unfold, the judge in that hearing said some things that stuck in my head. The judge's name is Daniel Coble. He's a brand new judge. He was just put on the bench by the lawmakers. But he said a few things during this hearing that stuck out to me because he pointed out that judges, in many cases, are being put in untenable situations. And while, again, I don't want anything I'm about to say to come off in any way, shape, or form as justification for our judges, I do think it's important to shine the spotlight across the system. Because it's not just judges. There are other links in the chain. In fact, we had a state lawmaker, Joe White, who's been leading the push for judicial reform in South Carolina. He talked about that chain. In fact, he had a chain he brought in. I almost thought it was like a gangster rap video there for a second. But he pointed out how if one link of that chain is weak, it falls apart. So this week, we've made a commitment to start focusing on the other links in that chain. We've told our friends in the bar, listen, if you've got allegations involving other steps of this process, the prosecutorial misconduct or law enforcement misconduct or shoddy investigations, or bring them to us. Because it is a fair point. If a judge has delivered the proverbial shit sandwich, well, what are you going to do but take a bite, right? So a big case, though, of prosecutorial misconduct was alleged just this week. And the details are sketchy. There was a hearing in Sumter, South Carolina earlier this week. Kind of came out of the blue. There was no advisory on it. This news outlet did not attend the hearing, but multiple sources who attended the hearing reached out to us shocked by what they'd heard. And the allegations focus on one of the top prosecutors from the Murdaugh murders, crime, and corruption saga. I know you're probably thinking, does everything in this state somehow have a nexus to the Murdaughs? Well, apparently so, but We're talking about Johnny Meadors. Now, Johnny Meadors was a late addition to the prosecutorial team on the Murdaugh case. He was brought in by lead attorney Creighton Waters to help handle some of the key witnesses. And in fact, he was the guy who delivered the rebuttal to the defense's closing argument. This is literally the guy who got the last word with the jury in the Murdaugh trial during the closing arguments. He was the guy who drove the nail in Alec Murdaugh's coffin, so to speak, as it relates to the state's case. But this week, Meadors was hit with some particularly egregious allegations of prosecutorial misconduct. And I'm not just talking about unethical lawyering here. We're talking about actual constitutional violations, which would infringe upon a defendant's right to a fair trial. Now, the details are sketchy, but everything seems to go back to a September 2019 shooting in Sumter, South Carolina, a gang shooting at a hop-in convenience store, a Sunoco gas station, where rival gangs had come together in the aftermath of the release of a music video called Boost the Murder Rate. Now, this video, it's still on YouTube. You can check it out. I'm not really a fan of the genre, but you can check that video out for yourself if you want. Boost the Murder Rate. But apparently this video precipitated, according to local law enforcement, the shooting violence that unfolded at that hop-in convenience store in Sumter 4 years ago. But it was one of the defendants in this case, who's charged with murder, by the way, DeAndre Epps, and according to federal prosecutors who testified at this hearing, information was provided to them which indicated that Epps, who again was involved in the shooting where 2 people were killed, several others wounded, indicated that Epps may have acted in self-defense. And again, I don't want to defend this Epps guy. Epps has a lengthy record, including some pleas on some very violent crimes. So again, I'm not saying this guy's an angel, far from it. And I'm certainly not representing that anything that was provided to the federal prosecutors about his case is accurate. But it was provided to them. Information, potentially exculpatory evidence, was provided to them. They turned around and then provided it to Johnny Meadors. But, and here's where this story gets interesting, Meadors is alleged not to have shared this with the defense. And in fact, not only that, he's alleged to have represented to the federal authorities that he would get the information and provide it, but then failed to do so. And in fact, allegedly told the federal prosecutor, hey, what are you doing? You're supposed to be helping my case. We've heard a few stories about Meadors playing fast and loose, but again, we want to give him the benefit of the doubt. But it points to an issue that, again, is very important because we've been dogging out judges a lot. In fact, it's a favorite pastime of this news outlet. But it, as I mentioned earlier, not just judges. There are cases where police screw up an investigation, where prosecutors play fast and loose, where you have deals like this that are presented to a judge, again, with very little leeway for them to take action one way or the other. So is it the judge's fault? Well, yes, but it's also a systemic problem. And again, go back to that chain. If one link in that chain is weak or broken, the whole chain is useless, utterly useless. And that's not fair to victims. That's not fair to those of us in the public who want to be able to go to our convenience stores without getting shot by gangbangers. It's not fair to any of us. But as this news outlet continues to investigate, these allegations against Meadors are not only significant as it relates to this case in Sumter. We are told that the defense attorneys for Alec Murdaugh are keeping a very close eye on this case as they continue their appeal. Remember, it was Johnny Meadors who, at the very end of his impassioned closing arguments, again, the guy with the last word for the state of South Carolina, he did make one error. He did make one key error. He talked about how the state didn't have to prove motive for Alec Murdaugh's crimes, which is true. They didn't. Motive is not required to be proven. But in a circumstantial case, like the one against Alec Murdaugh, motive was a huge factor because it allowed the state to introduce all of the financial crimes, which is really what sunk Alec Murdaugh, and which, incidentally, is in all likelihood why Murdaugh decided he had no recourse but to testify. Because at that point, with all that information out there about him stealing from friends, from former clients, including a deaf quadriplegic stealing from his family, stealing from his law firm. With all that out there, what other recourse do you have but to testify? But Meadors' admission there at the very tail end of that trial could play a major role in the Murdaugh appeal. And so any missteps, whether in that case or outside of that case, count on those Murdaugh lawyers to seize upon them. But again, bigger picture from where we sit and from where I'm speaking today, we've heard a lot of comments from the bar, a lot of comments from attorneys we trust, with whom we have very good relationships, who say that we've been unfair to the judges in the state. I don't believe that's true. I think every judge that we've called out has had it coming. But it is also our obligation to, again, shine that light wherever the blame lies, to find the truth wherever it's hiding. And if there are prosecutors who have stepped out of line, if there are cops who have fudged crime scenes, you better believe this news outlet will call them out every bit as aggressively and decisively and passionately as we call out those judges, because ultimately the goal is truth, the goal is justice, and we will never see those things if any part of that chain is failing us.
So Jennifer, this is our first segment on the Week in Review, and by the way, it's lovely to have you in Columbia, not in Louisiana.
I know, this is fun.
But this is our first segment bringing the Death on the Track story, or it's the story of the mysterious death of DJ Smith in Dorchester County, to the Week in Review audience.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully some of them have seen we've been following this story for 4 installments on our Fitz Files podcast. It's a show that comes out every Wednesday here on YouTube or on our podcast audio platforms. It's a show it's a true crime and corruption show, and this has been an unsolved case that we've been working on. Well, it's solved if you listen to the authorities, but we think it's an unsolved case and that we think that there's more to it. Do you want to explain to our audience here that might not know, just give them a brief synopsis of this case?
Yeah, so DJ, his full name is Daniel Reed Smith, but his parents call him DJ. His parents reached out to me actually during the Murdaugh trial and asked me to take a look at their story, at their son's death. He died in August of 2018, and his body was found on a remote section of railroad tracks in Ridgeville, which is in Dorchester County. And, you know, his mom is wonderful, and his stepfather actually is a seasoned law enforcement investigator. He used to work for the First Circuit Solicitor's Office as an investigator, and he's got 20 years of experience, and he has looked at DJ's death for 5 years. He has looked at all of the evidence collected by authorities, and they deemed it accidental. After doing their investigation and autopsy, they deemed the death accidental, and he said something just isn't right.
And we did some of the same work that he did. We kind of back-checked his reasoning for thinking that. And for those of you who don't know, DJ was found on train tracks. A train passed over him at least 5 times, actually exactly 5 times in the time between him being put on the track and one of these train conductors realizing, oh, that's a human being on the track. And the conclusion of the investigation was that DJ was hit by a train. But immediately upon seeing the autopsy photos, I was really questioning whether that was the case, because if you've ever seen a person or an animal be hit by a train, and you know, if you've been on the internet too much, you've probably seen that at one point in time or another. They get completely vaporized, like turned into mush. There's very little left of them. And DJ, that's simply not the case. Most of his body is intact. One of his legs was cut off, but not really in a way that you would expect from a train accident, where you would expect just a very rapid and clean removal. It was more like a tear. There's actually tire tread marks on his pants.
Right.
He has internal injuries consistent with being hit with the car. And so we received this information months ago, and we started doing research into it. And eventually we interviewed Eric and Lisa, who are DJ's parents. We published pieces of this interview, and we've kind of started publishing information that draws the conclusions made by SLED agent David Owen, who we might remember from the Murdaugh trial. He played a pivotal role in that investigation. He was the lead investigator. Well, he was the lead investigator on this case as well. we kind of have called some of his conclusions into question because there's a lot of things that don't point to him having died on those tracks. And you actually came to South Carolina this week so that we could drive down to Dorchester County and go to the very spot where DJ's body was found, to go to the last spot that he was known to be alive, this house where he was having a party with a bunch of his drug-using friends. And this is something else that you need to know. He was a methamphetamine user. Some say that he sold it, and he was found without, he was literally cleaned out. He was found with his pockets turned empty. He was missing one of his cell phones. It's believed that he had 2 cell phones. He was missing the handgun that he was known to carry. He was missing the knife that he was known to carry on his belt. And his backpack was 400 feet away from where his body was found. Kind of with all these things that seem like he was robbed post-mortem.
Right. So DJ's last night, he was at a party in Ridgeville with a group of friends. He had been clean on and off throughout the years, but it sounds like he had recently relapsed. And at some point during the night, and the stories from his friends are all very, very inconsistent. I've, tried to line them all up, but as to when he left, at some point during the night, he left the party in Ridgeville, and according to his friends, walked away. And the next day, about 18 hours later, his body was found lying in the middle of the rails on the train tracks in a remote section between Ridgeville and Somerville. Not next to the tracks, lying between the 2 rails. So it's initially, when you look at this, you think, well, was he walking down the tracks and trying to head
people
home?
On methamphetamine aren't known for making good decisions.
Right.
So walking down train tracks in the middle of the night and completely missing a train and getting creamed is not out of the question.
Right.
But one thing that really initially made me question whether that was what happened was the fact that there wasn't blood everywhere. I mean, if you're alive and you get struck by a train and your heart's pumping, your blood is going to rapidly dissipate from your body. But there was really very little blood on his clothing, very little blood all over him, and his head was completely caved in by either whatever killed him or by something that happened while he was laying on the train track, like perhaps a piece of the train hit him. But you look at these autopsy photos, and they're not for somebody with a light stomach, and they're not something that we've published, by the way. But you look at these autopsy images, and you see there's a distinct lack of blood that, to me and to a medical doctor who we've now spoken to, somebody who testifies in trials, a board-certified trauma doctor, she immediately concluded this is not somebody who died on those train tracks.
Yes. So the doctor reached out, and she'd been listening to the podcast and said, can I just take a look at the autopsy, the crime scene photos, the autopsy photos, and just, it's something doesn't feel right about it to me, but I'd like to look at it. She's got years and years of experience in trauma and emergency medicine. And so I sent it over. She called me within 10 minutes, and we went through everything together. And immediately she said, this absolutely is not consistent with a train versus pedestrian accident. She noted that the injuries that caused DJ's death were actually internal injuries. So they were injuries to the right side of his body, right in his abdomen area. And then when she looked at the scene photos, she said, there's no blood. There should be blood everywhere. The injuries to his head, the injuries to his leg, to his shoulder, they all should have been, there should be blood everywhere. Yes, if you've seen
somebody get hit by a train, it is absolutely grisly. It's gory. There's just gore everywhere. There's blood everywhere. It's a very ugly scene, and that's not what we saw.
Yeah, she said, so his injuries they're not traumatic enough where he got hit by a train head on. And they don't make sense in any other context. She said there's just not, the evidence that I'm looking at as a doctor indicates he died elsewhere. So I kept saying, okay, so what if he got tired while walking? And, I'm playing devil's advocate.
Sure.
I'm throwing all these different scenarios out. And he decided to, lay down on the tracks and take a break. And she said he didn't die here. Like there's absolutely no possible way.
And if he didn't die there, he was put there.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, it is what DJ's stepfather all along has told me, but it finally cemented in my mind that, that was not the crime scene. DJ was killed elsewhere and placed on the tracks.
And so we're conducting this investigation, and we have some pretty good leads that we haven't published because there's a real hope that this will be opened up again criminally and hopefully pursued in a court of law. So there is some things that the Melendez family, Eric, has requested that we don't run with at the moment, and we're going to honor that request.
Yes.
But the goal here is to understand, okay, if there's a valid reason for why law enforcement reached the conclusion that they did, we would like to have that reason become public.
Absolutely.
And if there's not a reason that is articulable, we would like to use our position here, having access to you and the public, to encourage them to do their jobs. And because it's really easy. We had a conversation yesterday with an attorney who's going to soon be involved in this case, and he used the phrase "no real person involved." And I nobody likes having drug abuse in their community. Law enforcement, they have to deal with people who are on drugs all the time. People who are on drugs are, they can be a real menace to their own families, to themselves. But there are people who are struggling with a problem. And when they're the victim of a violent crime, it's not at all okay if law enforcement treats it one way. And if you or I or somebody who's, a contributing member of society is killed, if they treat it a different way.
Right. I mean, it's DJ. I've gotten, I didn't know him while he was alive, of course, but through, speaking with his parents, his sisters, he was a human. He was loved. He was
a father. He's a son.
Right. And,
And he made terrible decisions.
Right.
He did. That's why he ended up on those tracks. In one way or another, he ended up with his brain outside of his head, his leg off of his body, dead on a train track at the age of 29. But nobody deserves that, and nobody deserves to have...
And every family deserves to have answers.
And the people that live in Ridgeville don't deserve to have murderers running around in their community just because they only choose to kill disadvantaged members of society. So that's why we're pursuing this story. And we're happy to be on this show to be able to put this in front of people who don't know about it. I'm very lucky that Jen came to South Carolina, obviously under terrible circumstances for DJ's family, but I really do treasure getting to spend time with you. Yeah,
now once we did feel confident in
Eric's,
DJ's father's conclusions, and we had a doctor, come back and tell us the same thing. The question now isn't, did he die in the tracks? It's now, how did he get on the tracks? How did he get to that section of tracks? And that's why I thought it was important for us to go down there.
And I think that we got some answers, or at least some insight into how he got there while we were
it's very remote, and you'll see when we publish the podcast
next Wednesday.
It's a very remote location, and it was not easily accessible when you look at it, if you don't look at it carefully. But when we really went around and looked at the area, it is not impossible.
No. And if this story is something that's interesting you, we've now done multiple episodes on this. I'm going to, right now, if you're watching on YouTube, you can click, there's a link appearing on the top right-hand side of the screen. Click that. Even if you're on a phone, it will work. Or if you're listening to this on podcast, just type in wherever you're getting this podcast, Fitz Files, and then look for Death on the Tracks, and that will be this series.
And this is the second story that we've covered, and we're just trying to give a deeper dive into the stories that we put on our website. Right. But the first story we covered was the Rose Petal murder.
Another ongoing story.
Yeah, which is another ongoing story out of Greenville, South Carolina, and that is absolutely one of the strangest criminal cases I've ever looked at, ever reported on. And I think, that one's ongoing. We're going to do more episodes on that as in
2 weeks, we're going to have a new episode on the Rose Petal murder.
Right.
And we got some exclusive footage when we were up. Will actually went up to Greenville and got video at a magistrate hearing where Zach Hughes and please, my brain is not working.
John Mello.
Yeah, Zach Hughes and John Mello. Thank you. Yeah. We're in the same room. And it was very interesting to see how they interacted. So we're going to be airing some of that and talking about that.
Yeah, but it's definitely this story. It's close to my heart. working with DJ's stepfather, who is a diligent investigator. He's talented, he's thoughtful, he's precise.
And I would not say he's biased.
Right. No, ever since the first time I spoke with him, he's always said, I am open to, I'm open to a conclusion where DJ, if somebody can show me that DJ was walking down the tracks and got hit by a train, I'm open to that.
It's just that the evidence does not line up with that conclusion.
And I kept going back and back. I'm like, what if? And I can't find any possible way that he died on the train tracks. There's just that I can't make that fit.
I can't make it fit, and I can't understand how somebody who's a special agent with the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, an agency I personally have a lot of respect for. I know there's a lot of really smart, really hardworking people who work there. So, and I have faith in that institution, but I don't understand exactly what was going on there, and I hope that we can get to the bottom of it.
Me too. And, they hopefully that, we FOIA'd investigative reports from SLED. We also FOIA'd investigative reports from Dorchester County. And because Eric had worked for the solicitor's office, they did conflict, the solicitor investigation to the 14th Circuit. And we FOIA'd them. And we did get all those reports back, and we did review them very carefully. And we're still going through everything. And the more sets of eyes we have on this, the more.
I think we're getting close to SLED kind of giving us their piece.
Right.
So I look forward to hearing that.
Right, me too.
And I look forward to seeing what we get going forward. But yeah, and folks, if you're interested in this story, check out next Wednesday if you've been following it, or if you have not yet heard any of this. I would encourage you to start at episode 1, watch what we've put out to this point, and next Wednesday, watch the show.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got a metric ton of political news to discuss this weekend. This is something we hadn't been able to do as often as I like to do. I mean, this was a political website. FITSNews, first in the South, started as a political website. So, although is that really what it stands for, Dylan? I don't know. We'll leave that for conjecture. But let's start the week. The death of California Senator Diane Feinstein. Now, this is going to upend a lot of apple carts in the Beltway, Dylan. What's your immediate reaction to the death of Feinstein? There's a lot of strong opinion on social media both ways.
I mean, as somebody who's come up, I'm 23 years old, so all of my lifetime, Diane Feinstein has been kind of decrepit, aging. But I have to say, one thing I do admire, when somebody passes away, you talk about the good things about them. She did a lot in exposing really just unfair treatment of political prisoners across the world by the CIA. I think that that's something that definitely took a lot of stones. So looking back at her legacy, that's something that I immediately think about. Obviously, her in recent years, she's been kind of weakened at Bernie's into the Senate, and I think that was very unfair to her. It was unfair to the American people. It makes you wonder who is actually making the decisions on her behalf. But now that she's passed, there's obviously this vacancy on the Judiciary Committee where she sat.
It's significant. And obviously her status, someone who was in decline for so many years, that impacted a lot of the ability of the Democrats in the Senate to get their judges confirmed, which could come into play as we look now toward the 2024 election. And let's talk about this. Obviously, a huge debate in Simi Valley, California at the Reagan Presidential Library this past week. But before we get into the debate, let's talk a little bit about sort of those bigger trend lines leading into it and coming out of it. And the first one, obviously, former President Donald Trump. I mean, this guy, the argument for the candidates running against him is that he can't win the general election. But, Dylan, we're seeing polling of late that would seem to indicate that argument doesn't hold as much water as it once did.
Right. We know a lot of these big national money Republicans were running advertisements directly targeting Donald Trump, saying he can't win. And I think some of those advertisements even ran on FITSNews.com. Well, if you look at the Real Clear Politics polling average, which compiles most of the big national polls, and I'm putting this on the screen right now as I'm editing, I think the immediate aftermath of that could be seen this week. California Governor Gavin Newsom had a big 60 Minutes appearance. And then after the debate, which we're here to talk about right now, he was in the spin room making the Democrat case. These are not things that happen by accident. I think that the DNC is lining him up to be slotted in Joe Biden's place. It's going to be very interesting to see how that might happen, though, because we have RFK Jr., who's really throwing a wrench in things, because he's a Democrat, he's running as a Democrat, and that means that the DNC, which is notorious for slotting in their own people regardless of what their primary voters want, is going to have to work for it.
Absolutely. That's one of the things I think it's important to focus in on. You know, what Trump did on the Republican side in 2016 was pretty much unprecedented. He was a guy running against the party establishment and won. On the Democratic side, we have not seen that. You know,
well, in 2016, Bernie Sanders tried to do a very similar thing, and I think that if the DNC had not sunk Bernie Sanders, and if you look into it, the DNC did sink Bernie Sanders,
absolutely,
I think that he would have beaten Donald Trump. He would have beat Donald Trump in 2016. He would have won the White House. Ruth Bader Ginsburg would have been replaced by a Democrat. But the hubris of the DNC to think we can pick the candidate, not the people, because the reality is they would not have controlled Bernie Sanders nearly as much as they would have controlled Hillary Clinton, they being the donor class that puts our national politicians in office. They might be about to shoot themselves in the foot again on that front.
Well, and don't forget South Carolina's starring role in that process, the first in the South on the Democratic side. But Biden, after South Carolina literally saved his bacon in 2020, he was, remember, done after New Hampshire and Iowa. And it was South Carolina that gave him the victory that put him back into the mix, gave his campaign a heartbeat in 2020. He rewarded the state by putting South Carolina #1 on the Democratic calendar this go-round.
Yeah, he put South Carolina #1 on the calendar, and RFK actually just made a big ad buy. I don't know if you saw Meg Kennard from the AP initially reported this, but he's going to be buying billboards across the state. So RFK clearly knows that this is the battleground. Maybe he'll come into this studio and talk to us.
We'd love
try
to
to reach
him,
some
man.
Potential South Carolina voters, although I don't know. I think we have a pretty broad-ranging audience, so it could be a useful appearance for him. But if I were him, what I would be running were the decades of clips of Joe Biden saying horribly racist things in the Senate, because he's been in the Senate for a very long time, and it wasn't until the 2000s that he stopped saying terrible things about black people. So there's a lot of stuff that he could run on the airwaves in South Carolina that I think would probably not make the primary voters in the Democrat Party so inclined to vote for Joe Biden.
And aren't you glad you work in a news outlet you can say things like that?
Because I mean, it's true.
You're not allowed to say that on the mainstream media about Biden's racist past. You're just not allowed to discuss it.
Yeah.
But here we do.
It's true.
Yeah, it is what it is. Well, going into the debate, again, we've talked about Trump looking better against Biden than certainly I thought he would. Biden looking far worse than I thought he would at this stage of the race. Rumblings on the Democratic side. But now let's talk about the sort of undercurrent amongst the Republican challengers. The Ron DeSantis campaign. I mean, this is a guy who last fall looked like he had everything lined up to be the Republican nominee. Trump was getting blamed for the election. DeSantis had just scored a historic victory in Florida, a key swing state. All of the trend lines seem to be pointing to a gap closing between Trump and DeSantis emerging as a viable threat to the former president. Dylan, that has not been the way it's unfolded over the last few months.
Yeah, DeSantis made a really effective governor in Florida. He did well to win that race. But I think he has some serious personality problems in that he's kind of robotic, kind of a stiff. He comes off as very artificial. And I don't think that that's been playing that well in the polls.
Well, you talked about that, and you mentioned something interesting to me this week. You said it's not just about when he's talking. You pointed out about what happens when he stops talking.
Well, actually, I do think, like, Ron DeSantis, when he's talking, he's delivering his lines. He does pretty well. And then at the end, he kind of has, like, I don't know if you've ever been to, like, the Wax Figure Museum or Disney World, like, at the end of the ride when the animatronics stop talking and their face kind of completely freezes up. He has the habit of doing that, and he needs to break that because it's very unnatural. It's not a good look.
I like how you worked a Disney metaphor in there.
That was not intentional, although I wish I could take credit for that.
Oh, come on. So DeSantis' campaign has really imploded. He needed a good night in Simi Valley this week.
He didn't have a terrible one. I thought he did pretty well, but pretty well is not good enough when you're in the position that he's in.
Well, let's talk about how he did. We're looking at 538 has done polling after these two debates to sort of get an immediate kind of snapshot of how Republican voters interpreted the performance. And DeSantis did the best. 33% of likely GOP voters indicated that he won that debate. Only 5% said he did the worst. Meanwhile, Nikki Haley came in second. I believe it was 18% said she did the best. Only 7% rated her the worst. Tim Scott also had some good numbers, but they were so low compared to DeSantis and Haley. It's almost like he's a non-factor factor. Those were kind of the three I was watching during the debate. Dylan, who were you watching in that debate to make a breakthrough in this race to present some sort of alternative to Trump?
I mean, you know me, I'm a numbers guy. I'm a facts-based guy, so I wasn't really watching anybody on the stage other than DeSantis and Haley for a serious chance to become the Republican nominee for president. I have to say the loser of the debate, I think, was Fox News. That was the most poorly moderated debate I've ever seen. I think that they needed to mute people's microphone channels. I mean, how many times during that debate was it just a cacophony of Republican pablum just overlaying, across one another? They need to, when they're hosting these debates, especially if you're going to let everybody who's decided that they want to run for president, this cycle on the stage at the same time, you need to mute people's microphones and ideally cut it down to the top 3 or 4 candidates. I did not really get very much out of the debate. 1, because of the questions, and 2, it was run very poorly, I thought.
Well, and yeah, Mark Powell, our political writer, referred to it as a verbal traffic jam.
Yes.
I think that was his term.
I was watching this at a bar, and there was multiple TVs, so there's already a little bit of echo. Mm-hmm. So then when this would start happening, it was literally completely unintelligible for multiple minutes at a time.
Mm-hmm. So winners and losers really aren't based on the exchanges during the debate, because there weren't really any. I mean, this was kind of like the first one, and I think Mark Powell actually said it best. He was like watching a movie you've already seen before and realizing it wasn't that good the first time.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree with that assessment.
So, talking about moving forward, obviously the candidate with all the momentum going into the first debate was Tim Scott. Clearly that momentum was not seized upon by his campaign. The candidate with all the momentum going into the second debate, Nikki Haley. She is rising in polling nationally, in New Hampshire, in Iowa, in South Carolina. She's running a strong second in 2 of those 3 critical early voting states. Dylan, Nikki Haley's got a real shot here all of a sudden.
How do you define a real shot?
If Trump dies, she could probably be the nominee.
All right. Yeah, if that's how you define a real shot, then Nikki Haley has a real shot. She has a real shot at becoming number 2, but when you have an already viable-ish number 2, now you're struggling to become the viable number 2, it really is just watering down the anti-Trump Republican portion. And Trump, if you look at polling, consistently has about a quarter of the Republican base that are just not going to vote for anybody other than Donald Trump, which is a real problem for these other candidates, because then if they split the difference, you do the math, it's still a Trump win.
Yeah, the numbers are just insurmountable if things stay, again, as they are. And again, obviously, there's a lot of wild cards with Trump. We talk about Biden's health, but, Trump's not a spring chicken, doesn't have the best diet.
Is facing like 90 indictments.
Well, the indictments as well. And it was interesting in the debate. There was one clip. I'm obviously not a Christy fan. I think he's one of the people that's taking up unnecessary space on the stage, a lot more space than some of the other guys. Hey-yo. But Christy had a comment there. And let's see if we can cut to this from we featured this on our site, but this is Christy calling out Trump. And I think he did this actually pretty well. Let's cut to that real quick.
Yeah, Donald, I know you're watching. You can't help yourself. You're not here tonight because you're afraid of being on the stage and defending your record. You're ducking these things. And let me tell you what's going to happen. You keep doing that, no one up here is going to call you Donald Trump anymore. We're going to call you Donald Duck.
All right, so Dylan, he had a good thing going there, but then this Donald Duck thing,
Well, the thing that resonated with me the most from Chris Christie was his comments about Trump's fiscal mismanagement. I mean, if you grew up a conservative, if you were a conservative for a long time, that was associated with the government spending less money, and Trump refused to touch Medicare, refused to touch Medicaid, refused to touch Social Security, because they're live wires when it comes to electoral politics. But if you look at our national debt, Donald Trump really contributed to that, and I think a lot of candidates got good hits on him for that. And I'm glad they did, because I think that's where there's the most daylight between your average Republican primary voter and Donald Trump. But I think that Chris Christie articulated that really well. The Donald Duck line, I mean, when you're delivering a joke and you have a punchline, you got to do a little pause, and then you got to make sure that the joke is actually funny before you start telling the joke. That, to me, was pretty bad.
So we're fat-shaming Chris Christie and dogging out his comedic timing.
You're fat-shaming Chris Christie, and I'm dogging out his comedic timing.
Fair enough. You did raise a good point, though. The Trump fiscal sellout, it started early. It started very early. It was mid-2017, one of the first fiscal debates within the Republican caucus, Trump really caved to the establishment, and it continued throughout his presidency. You will recall December of 2020, he's already a lame duck. He's on his way out. They send him this COVID stimulus bill. He calls it a disgrace and then signs it.
And that's when Ron DeSantis pulled out his veto pen. And I thought, obviously it was very canned. It was way too rehearsed. But such is the case with everybody on that stage, honestly. But I thought that was his strongest moment of the night when he pulled that pen out and said, look, if I don't like a bill, I'm not signing it. Although he didn't say it as candidly and as much like a human being as I just said that. But he got that same point across.
Well, and again, it boils down to the essence of the case against Donald Trump, which is that he campaigned on eliminating deficits. He campaigned on reducing debt. He campaigned on broad-based middle-class tax relief. None of those things did he deliver on. Middle class got some tax relief, but the vast majority of his tax cut was for the uber wealthy, and I think that that's something that the Republican candidates could use against him. But again, time is not their friend at this point in the race, is it?
Not at all. One interesting thing from Nikki that I noted, she went after Vivek very hard. Nikki was coming out swinging during this debate. Vivek has started multiple successful businesses. He's brought multiple drugs that would not otherwise exist to market that are helping people in the real world with real medical problems. Nikki Haley's been a career politician. So for her to say to somebody who's actually done real things that have come to market in the world, that have created value for people that otherwise wouldn't exist, and say, oh, listening to you makes me stupid. And I genuinely think if they both took an IQ test that he would have 10, 15 points on her. That came off as very disingenuous to me.
And also kind of unnecessary, because if you think about it, in the political world's a lot like the boxing. You don't punch down. And if Haley's on the upswing, her numbers are rising. She's again second place.
Well, punching him is punching Trump. He's an analog for Trump. He's the Trump voodoo doll on that stage.
Fair enough. But it does come off to me anyway as you're going after somebody who you're ahead of. Why, focus on him? But I guess you're saying it's a means to an end as far as criticizing
It's a way to hit the guy that wasn't on the stage. And they all did a good job of hitting Donald Trump for not being there. But also, if you look at the last debate, he didn't show up. His poll numbers went up. What is his incentive, if you look at the game theory, to go to that debate?
That's true. Trump went to Michigan instead and was weighing in on the big United Auto Workers strike there. Joe Biden obviously went there as well, standing in the picket line. I thought that there was a good line in there about how Biden doesn't belong on the picket line and he belongs on the unemployment line. I thought that was one of the good lines of the evening. But again, these contenders, these sound bites, we hear them. They're here today. They're gone tomorrow. They're a flash on social media, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. But what are they doing to actually move the numbers? And that's what we're going to have to assess and analyze over the coming weeks as we see the fallout from this debate. Obviously, we've got another debate coming up in November, but time is running out. This runway for these candidates is very short at this point, Dylan.
Yeah, it is. And, I'm a political junkie, so I keep up with the political news, the political chatter. That debate was in and out of the bloodstream within 48 hours for sure. It definitely did not have a lasting impact. I don't think that there was a material change in the positioning of the candidates.
And yet all the money, all the attention, all the media focus.
It's going to make some big decisions as far as how GOP mega donors are going to allocate their capital. I think a lot of money that was going into the DeSantis war chest is going to be moving into the Haley war chest. The question is, does that matter when Donald Trump has the same amount in his war chest from small dollar donors, most of his donors under $200, and he has a similar war chest to these candidates that are getting financed by donors who are donating in the tens and hundreds of millions?
So Trump, let me ask you this question. Heading into the first debate, Trump's the presumptive GOP nominee. Coming out of the first debate, Trump's the presumptive GOP nominee. Heading into the second debate, same thing. Coming out of the second debate, Trump's still presumptive nominee in your view?
I don't see how that changes. I do think that the nominee that we got to see could be Gavin Newsom. He was working that spin room after, and I'm telling you, people, he was not doing that for no reason. So keep your eye on Gavin Newsom. I think he's got a bright future there in the Democratic Party. How they will get him or whoever else onto the ticket, I'm not sure. But it's not looking good for Joe Biden. A lot of these news outlets that usually hold water for him are finally starting to run stories about the corruption that him and his family are just. There's so much documentation when you commit financial crimes. This is something that anybody that follows the Meadors saga knows. They have him dead to rights. If another prosecutor takes a look at this that's actually willing to indict people, he's in a bad spot. And I think that the DNC knows this, and they know that they need to get him out because there's a lot of documentation behind the pretty crooked business dealings that has been coming out in recent months. So look to see who the DNC is grooming, because I think that that's where there's a lot more room for a new candidate to emerge, not on the right. I think things are pretty locked up on the right.
Well, we're looking at Trump-Biden, a rematch, but as you correctly point out, Democrats may wise up at some point and
they have
make a move.
They have to. With this gap in the polling, there's no way that they let Joe Biden be led to the slaughterhouse.
Heard it here first, folks. Dylan Nolan
First in the South, question mark?
Calling it. Joe Biden will not be the Democratic nominee. That's a bold prediction. I like it. We miss this stuff. We got to do this more, man. This political back and forth. This is what, again, this website was founded on. If you followed FITSNews long enough, you know that we broke all the big political stories in South Carolina. And now I'm going to share with you a big story we broke last week and the fallout from that story coming up in this next segment. Dylan, thank you, man. Let's do this again, man.
Let's do it.
All right, so if you've been following our news outlet for the last few months, you know all about the Days of Our Congressman saga involving William Timmons, a social conservative from the South Carolina upstate who's been mixed up in a sex scandal for the better part of the last year and a half. Well, now we've got another South Carolina congressman who basically said, hold my holy water. I'm going to double down on the hypocrisy. Jeff Duncan, congressman from the South Carolina 3rd District. Now, as we were filming this show last week, while we were filming, our news outlet broke the story that Jeff Duncan had been named in a divorce filing by his estranged wife, Melody Hodges Duncan, and accused of having not one, but at least 2 extramarital affairs while promoting himself as, again, a faith, family values, social conservative Christian Republican. Now, again, if you follow this news outlet for any length of time, you realize pretty quickly that we don't like to dig into people's personal lives. We are libertarian leaning. We tend to believe that unless you're wasting tax money or breaking the law or other misconduct tied to your extramarital dalliance, we try to stay away from it. It just really isn't much of our business. But in this case, one of the qualifications that we put on those stories is hypocrisy, and particularly galling, demonstrative, over-the-top hypocrisy where you say one thing in public and then do one thing in private. And according to Duncan's wife's filing, this hypocrisy was particularly galling because at the end of last month, Duncan was hosting his big annual Faith and Freedom barbecue and talked about how he loved his wife and how his wife was such a strong support and he was a loving husband. But apparently right after that event, he went to D.C. to move in with his mistress, a lobbyist, former lobbyist anyway, for the National Rifle Association. We've got that picture up here if you want to take a look. Liz Williams is her name. But this story, over the course of the past week, has been interesting because obviously we've covered the William Timmons story, his sex scandal for quite a long time now, watching how he's handled it. But it's been interesting to see how Duncan has handled this scandal. And basically it's by saying a whole lot of nothing. Duncan, in fact, did not speak, did not address this scandal, even as it was exploding across New York Post, Politico, all of these outlets, national outlets covering the scandal. Didn't say a word until this Wednesday. It's when he went on X, formerly known as Twitter, and issued the following statement. I want to read it here real quick. This is what Duncan had to say. My family is dealing with a difficult and private moment, and I'm not going to comment on a deeply personal matter. My focus is fighting on behalf of the people of South Carolina's 3rd District as we stare down the barrel of a government shutdown as the liberal extremists try forcing us to continue spending beyond our means. It's those damn liberal extremists that did all this, obviously. I'm proud to have one of the most conservative voting records in all of Congress, and that is the approach I will continue taking on behalf of my constituents to fight back against this fiscal insanity. You see what he did there? People, you see what he did there? And it wasn't just this one acknowledgement of the deeply personal matter. Duncan has been machine gunning red meat on fiscal issues to his constituents since the news of the affair first broke. So that's one part of the response. But the other part of the response is interesting. It's political, because it didn't take long for Duncan's potential political opponents to seize on this affair. And I'm referring to Richard Cash. Richard Cash is a senator from the state of South Carolina, a very arch conservative. I mean, you think Jeff Duncan is to the right. This guy is further to the right of Martin Luther. Okay, this guy is way to the right. So we're talking about a guy Bible thumping, Bible beaten to the nth degree. But Cash came out with a statement that called on Duncan to repent before God, to resign, and to be reconciled to his wife and family. Now, Duncan, again, has made no indication publicly of his plans, but we are told, in fact, I put this out on our social media, X, formerly known as Twitter, put that out exclusively this week, that Duncan is running for an 8th term. And again, why wouldn't he? Guys, this is one of the most influential members of the South Carolina delegation. He's got a huge seat at the table when it relates to the big energy debate that's coming to the Palmetto State, both at the state level and up in Washington, D.C. He's got $840,000 in the bank as of the last quarter for his reelection. We're told that number is going to eclipse $1 million when the FEC publishes its latest reports early next month, early in October. So, again, Duncan in a much better position to weather the scandal that he's facing than perhaps William Timmons. And the way Duncan is handling it also appears to be, so far, paying far better dividends for him than the way that William Timmons handled it. So again, this news outlet broke this story last week. We've been following it very closely as it continues to unfold. We will keep you posted not only on developments out of Washington, D.C. as it relates to the Duncan scandal, which has drawn the attention of a number of insiders up there in the Beltway, but also how it's impacting Duncan back home in the 3rd District and potential challengers he might face. Once again, we break these stories at FITSNews, but we don't just break them. We provide that critical context as to why they matter to the Palmetto political world. So count on us to continue doing that here at FITSNews. All right, that is a wrap for this week's edition of Your Weekend Review. I want to send a special shout out to our Director of Special Projects, Dylan Nolan, and our Research Director, Jen Wood. Jen came out from Louisiana this week to help lead that investigation into the Death on the Track story that you just heard about. And that reminds me, if you haven't already, go to Apple, go to Spotify, go to Google, wherever you download podcasts, and check out Fitz Files. We've been putting a ton of effort into that podcast, and it shows with the work that Jen, Dylan, and our whole team are doing. So please check that out. And once again, thank you for tuning into the Weekend Review. We will check you next time.